Stavros, who really needs no introduction, but I will go ahead and give you one anyway. The co-head of global private equity firm KKR, but also the founder of Ownership Works, a nonprofit organization that promotes a worker ownership movement globally to dramatically increase the financial well-being and resilience of our workforce, which you are doing extraordinary things with, and we're going to really dive deep into today. So thanks for what you're doing, and thanks for being here today.
Thanks for the kind words, and thanks for having me.
So one of the reasons we love this so much at the Center for Social Capital is we talk a lot about the real value of social benefit and social capital, not just about being nice, but how it really works to change society and makes capitalism work better. And you have really proven that and really explicated that in so many powerful ways. But I'd really love to kind of start off with how you came to realize that. And one of the things I always love to talk about is origins. And I've read some amazing things about your family influences and how that came to kind of make you realize this. Could you share a little bit with our viewers about that?
Sure. My dad, I talk a lot about this. My dad was an hourly construction worker. He was a road grader. So he paved roads for a living, earned an hourly wage with a union shop in Chicago, did that for 40 years. And my dad always brought work home to the dinner table. So we talked a lot about what it was like to be an hourly worker. You know, hard to build wealth, earning whatever, $15 an hour. You know, there's really nobody listens to you, which always, my dad found on the one hand understandable because there was no incentive. So why would a company think someone paid by the hour is going to find ways to do a job more productively? Because if you do it faster, your hours go down and your paycheck follows. So on the one hand, he understood it. On the other hand, it was frustrating to him because he felt like, hey, I'm doing the work. I'm closest to the job. I probably have the best ideas. Why doesn't anyone, solicit my ideas? And then the third thing was this incentive alignment or misalignment problem. Half the country earns an hourly wage. If you want to misalign people, it's the perfect way to pay someone. Pay them for time, not quality, productivity, customer satisfaction, give them no incentive. So that was, and there was a lot of conflict between my dad's union and the company. It was nonstop. And my dad's dream was some kind of worker ownership, profit sharing, didn't need to be, letter of the law shares in the company, but he wanted some way to give workers a chance to build wealth, to give companies a reason to listen to workers because the incentives would be aligned. And, unfortunately it never happened, but that was certainly a big influence on me. I wish I could tell you I then left home and I was like dead set on pushing employee ownership. In truth, it was nowhere on my mind. My folks didn't go to college, really struggled financially when I was a kid. I think it was the idea that not only was this clearly good for workers, because workers had a chance to build wealth, be happier on the job, more engaged, but there was a real business case. I think where a lot of the do-gooding in business falls down is when we're relying on good intentions. Good intentions don't scale. But in this, I was seeing on the one hand, workers feeling oftentimes through ownership and the ethos that it encompasses, feeling respected and trusted and included for the first time ever in their careers. And at the same time, when the cultural shift really took hold and it was effective, you saw companies benefiting from dramatically lower quit rates, much higher engagement scores, which then of course translate into all sorts of good things to the business. So I think that was it. And the other great thing is there's a real emotional appeal to this. When I can show people that moment when a worker's life is changed, or an employee talking about, geez, I was in debt up to my eyeballs. I thought I'd never get out, and this ownership program gave me a chance. Those employee testimonials, all that emotional power, I think, is what is going to propel this. It's one thing to cite the data and the business case, and here's what it can do for workers. It's another thing to actually see it and feel it and hear from people.
Yeah, and I love what you said about, intentions don't scale. It's such a big part of what we talk about at the Center for Social Capital, and why capitalism works and how capitalism works best is when there is this exchange of services and needs, and everybody's being fulfilled, everybody's being taken care of, all the stakeholders are being taken care of. And we interview a lot of founders of companies like Bombas, for instance, who gives a pair of socks away for everyone that they sell. And one of the things the founder told us was, I wanted to help homeless people, but nonprofits just don't scale as well as businesses do. And this was a tremendous opportunity to scale our ability to help. And I think that's perfectly coincident with what you're talking about here. And talking about scaling, I mean, you have some incredible goals for ownership works, to create 20 billion of dollars worth of wealth for working families over the next decade. You've already done a great job, from what I understand. The latest figures are something like 500 million of wealth shared with a broad base of workers. And 113 companies have implemented board-approved shared ownership plans. 163,000 employees impacted by shared ownership. So it seems like it's on a track to work extremely well. Correct?
Yeah, the 500 million you mentioned is really it's only the amount distributed in cash. So there's another 7.5 billion that's out there in stock for frontline workers. So we're already really
Okay.
in our minds at 8 billion. Now it's got to convert to cash. The companies need to perform, but we're just getting going. We're only 3 years into this. I mean, that's what is so
Wow.
exciting to me is the numbers get so big so fast in the context of a country where half of America basically has no net worth. I could see us creating 100 billion of wealth for workers. I think that's totally
Wow.
possible.
Wow.
And the other thing about this effort is you mentioned capitalism. I mean, this really strikes at the Achilles heel of capitalism. The problem with capitalism is the rewards are very unequally shared. And
Mm.
this is, there's lots of talk about inclusive capitalism. And to me, this is it. Like, include people. If we're going to talk about
Mm.
inclusive capitalism, everyone's got to participate. And, any economist would say capitalism is the best way to organize an economy, but has this very unfortunate side effect. Well, we can fix it. We can have everybody participate in ownership. It is fixable.
And obviously, Ownership Works is a nonprofit devoted to creating this vision of the future and so on and so forth. But you're practicing what you preach, and that you've implemented this throughout KKR's portfolio of companies and many of your own companies, correct?
Yeah. So we've been at this 15 years. So we started out in one industry vertical in one country, just in the United States, just in industrials. We did maybe a half dozen test cases, and then it expanded to other industry verticals, and now we do it globally. So we've done this in Vietnam, Japan, all over Western Europe. And the goal is that we'll do this everywhere in the world, anytime we have operational control. So yeah, we're kind of eating our own cooking, so to speak. We really believe in this. We've seen the benefits. It is not just one important point is it's not magic, right? It's not like you give workers ownership and all of a sudden like everyone's happy. That's
Right.
like not what happens. What happens is you give everyone ownership and there's skepticism, there's cynicism, there's typically low levels of engagement. The workforce is typically churning at a pretty quick rate. So you're starting from a place of oftentimes deep mistrust or distrust. And you gotta kind of dig your way out. So it is an investment you're making in the culture of the company. It takes a lot of work to build on top of that foundation of ownership, a different kind of culture. And it takes years and there's no guarantee it's going to work. So it's like any investment, just probably a little bit longer in terms of duration than many possible investments out there.
And you talked about the emotion, the emotional appeal, and some of these anecdotes and stories when you see it working. Are there any anecdotes that you can think of just off the top of your head, companies that you worked with, where you just really saw the life potential of this in action, and it maybe affected you personally when you saw it work?
Oh God, so many. And I honestly don't like to talk about them because I get choked up easily, reciting them. But everything from, employees who were in a mountain of debt and on antidepressants, and that changed their life. They got out of debt and over time, got off of antidepressants.
Wow.
I know couples who were in so much debt and financial trouble and under such a mountain of student debt that they had, decided, hey, we can't have a family, can't afford it.
Oh
And,
gosh.
as a result of the program, totally shifted gears on that, revisited the decision, and today have a family. So there's an endless number of stories where this isn't like, hey, somebody bought a new car, although there are those too. But a lot of these stories are just really remarkable in terms of the impact it's had on people's lives. And, you feel like kind of puts their family on a different trajectory.
Wow.
Kids going to college who never would have gone to college. Like I said, even much more dramatic examples than that.
So this is really generational transformation that you're talking about, enabling families to completely change their lives and, give a better life to their children, to their children's children. I mean, that is totally society changing, in all kinds of ways. When you see that, happening, what do you see as the grand vision for this outside of the numbers long term? How do you see this transforming business and society?
Okay, so this is going to take, decades, but here's the big hope is we prove the business case in the US. It starts to become more common. From an ownership works perspective, we're just, we're almost 40 people, but we're only one office in New York and they're drowning in work. So we got to scale that up. But then my hope is we open up satellite offices, and I think you'll see announcements in the next 12 months where we're opening up offices in Asia, in Western Europe. And if you could there's about 8 countries in the developed and developing world that when you look at a multinational company, if you had an ownership works office in those 8, you'd be touching most of the workforce. And, companies are global today, right? The S&P 500, 40% of the revenue is ex-US. So we can't
Oh
only
yeah.
be thinking US. So let's say we get to that state where we've got global ownership works is a global model. Behind that, we then would like to pursue policy. Now we're already doing that in the US. This is separate from ownership works. It's an effort called Expanding ESOPs. It's about 80 organizations coming together to dig up the old ESOP laws from the 70s and modernize and revitalize them. And this provides a tax incentive for more distributed share ownership inside of companies. If we could do that, then imagine we could replicate that tax structure in those 8 countries I mentioned. That's where you could really start to see this take off globally. And that's the goal. The goal, there's so many, on the margin ideas that lots of smart people are working on. This is a much bigger swing. This is trying to really change the way, the global economy works, for working folks. And again, it's not just about money. When this is done well, this is about a different kind of culture where employees, feel like they're included, they're a part of it. And smart CEOs leverage that into a much different way of operating.
And right back to that whole idea of, capitalism, not to get overly philosophical here, but, when you read about Adam Smith and his whole idea is this circle of prosperity and value. And, he's got a great quote that we talk about all the time that, no matter how selfish man may seem to be, he wants to see the betterment of others. And, to be able to bring together this business case and what we believe is the desire for people to see. And you're talking about this beautiful grand vision. One of the elements I think in people that leads to this, and you've talked about it, and we talk about it a lot. What kind of leaders does this appeal to? And you talk about empathy a lot, and I love the concept of empathy and the idea of empathy. Do leaders of companies that are going to do this need to be empathetic, and what is the value of that empathy from a business perspective?
Okay, so the way I got on this empathy line of reasoning was, as I mentioned, this doesn't always work. Okay, like I could show you two similar companies that we provide the same support to. They both roll out ownership programs. We both help them think through how to drive employee engagement, how to get the quit rate down, how to teach financial literacy. And in one company, engagement scores go way up and quit rates go way down. And in the other company, nothing happens. It doesn't get worse, but people don't become less likely to quit. And we have for years, because we've been at this 15 years, been beating our heads against the wall on what is going on. These are similar companies and they have the same tools. And of course, it might not surprise you, we think it comes down to leadership, more so than like the exact type of company and where it's located and how many employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like the leader. So from there, I started to notice anecdotal patterns in the types of leaders who did really well with creating this ownership culture. So for example, CEOs who grew up poor tended to do really well in creating this ownership culture that we're speaking about. Women tended to be really good at this. Immigrants tended to be really good at this. People of deep religious faith tended to be really good at creating these ownership cultures. And then when I started to think about it, it's like a common thread is this is a generalization, but those tend to be more empathic than your average leader. So I was giving a talk on this, and a reporter picked up on it and wrote, it was a very short piece. It was something about empathy. I don't even remember it. And a professor at Stanford named Jamil Zaki, who has studied empathy for his whole career, reached out and said, hey, I'd like to really engage with you on this. And so, it's too early to kind of talk about everything we're working on. But this empathy thing, to answer your question, I believe it to be a very big deal and something that's not well understood in terms of just how important it is to have a leader who's empathic to create the kind of cultures I'm talking about. And the high level explanation as to why it's so important is because this is so hard. And if you don't have a leader who really, really cares and is willing to put his or her heart and soul into it and suffer a lot of setbacks and give it years of, intense effort, it's not going to work. So, we'll be back with more on this. We're doing a lot of research on it. But I think empathy is a big deal in terms of a personality trait of a leader.
Well, I agree with you 100%. In fact, we have a whole feature that we do on empathy because we found that it was such a distinguishing characteristic for successful social capital leaders that are able to integrate these inclusive types of policies and really get their whole workforce on board to, kind of a team perspective. And the leaders that had that empathy were able to really do that authentically, and the ones that didn't, they just couldn't pull it off. And so we're really eager to find out what you find out about it too, and we'd love to. Please let us know as soon as you get all that info, because we would love to talk about it, even more. So we have the grand goal. We know where you're going with this. What needs to happen in the short run? And you talked a little bit about, you not only have the ownership works, but you have the complementary organization that you're working with. Talk a little bit about that, and how are you in the short run, in the very immediate run, trying to get as many companies on board to do this as you can?
So let's see, there's on the ownership work side, so let's just call that the model where there's no tax incentive. There, we just need to really prove out the business case. So we're gathering lots of data on what does it mean for workers, how much equity, what does the return look like, how well can we prove out this case around quit rates going down and engagement scores going up. And if we do that well, we'll continue to scale and we'll blow past that $20 billion goal. But if we want true change, and so if we want like not 20 billion, 50 billion, even 100 billion, but if we want like trillions of wealth for workers, 10% of all the equities in the country would be like $7.5 trillion.
Wow.
So, you know, it doesn't seem crazy to me that workers could own 5 or 10% of every
Yeah.
company if we set up the right policy. And that would be a fundamentally different type of economy and country, in my view. There we need policy, and so that's where expanding ESOPs comes in. And there we've got that's a political effort, that's a lobbying effort, that's trying to get legislation passed, and that's going to take time. That's not going to happen in 1 year. That's going to take time.
And I'm sure that's a whole other half an hour conversation, but are there a couple of things or, some major policy changes that you think need to happen quickly in order to make that a reality?
There are. I wish it could. I always get asked by members of the House and Senate, like, what's the one thing we got to change? And unfortunately, it's very complicated. This is a part of the ERISA Act. It's 51 years old. It was written at a time when the economy was very different, and we need to modernize the law. And it's a series of things that need to change. So, but in a nutshell, I would say the tax incentive needs to make sense to a company. So a company would look at this and say, yeah, I'll do a partial ESOP. And then we need to clarify the law, let's say, so there's less litigation. So right now, this is overseen by the Department of Labor. And look, there's been some bad actors that the DOL has had to go after where they've taken advantage of the tax incentive and not given workers a fair deal. But more often than not, I would say it's the ambiguity of the law that leads to a lot of the contention between the DOL and the plaintiffs bar on the one hand and ESOP companies on the other.
Well, Pete, there's so much that we could talk about here. We could talk for hours, but I think you've done a marvelous job of sharing this with your viewers and your vision and your practical vision for this, which we are so on board with, and want to talk about this as much as we can and help you with that vision. Is you say it's not magical necessarily, but it is monumental, and I think this is world changing. And so, thank you so much for doing what you're doing. Like I said, we're totally on board with you and look to support you and talk about this as much as we can. And I want to thank you so much for taking this time today and sharing this with our viewers. And I know it's going to be incredibly appealing, and I hope a lot of them reach out. The best way for them to learn more about this would be to go to Ownership Works, would you say, as a starting point?
Yeah, so there's two websites, ownershipworks.org and then expandingesops.com. That's the latter is the policy push.
Wonderful, wonderful. So thank you again. I really appreciate it. And we will look forward to talking to you a lot in the future about your progress and everything that you're learning as you continue to change the world. We really appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you, Pete. Bye-bye.
Bye.